Hello, this is Coding Gicha for full-stack developers. When hosting a web application on a server and serving it, the most concerning aspect is backup. The web server could be infected with malware, its disks could be damaged, or the server could be destroyed in a fire. Furthermore, software errors or brute force attacks may force you to urgently switch to a different server. Sometimes backups can be handled programmatically within the web application, but I personally find this quite pessimistic. This article explains how to remove the coupling with the web application and handle backups using a shell script. I'll also explain how to use a Git repository for incremental backups for faster backups. I'll connect to the web server via SSH. By registering a host in the SSH client configuration file, you can not only omit options but also easily enter the host name using autocompletion. Let's check the data targets to be backed up. Let's start by checking the data stored in the database. If the MariaDB user is the root account, authentication is performed using Unix socket authentication, so there's no need to enter a username and password. For the sake of illustration, I've created a schema called gurum. More schemas may be used on a production server. Let's also check the directory where the web application is deployed. By default, it's managed as the /var/www directory, but I've changed it to the /var/web directory. Currently, there's only one domain, gurum.org, but since I can service multiple domains simultaneously, I prefer to create a directory for each primary domain and manage secondary domains in subdirectories. I'm using Nginx as my web server. For Nginx, I need to back up the site-specific configuration files. Since site-specific configuration files can also be used across multiple domains, it's recommended to use a configuration file name that combines the primary and secondary domains with a dash to group them by domain during searches. The site's available directory contains configuration files for available sites, but the configurations for the sites currently in service are symbolic linked files in the site's enabled directory. If you're using Apache Tomcat, you should back up the server.xml file. This file contains host-specific configuration information. If you've configured additional configurations, you should also back up those files. It's also a good idea to back up your certificate file. Depending on your environment, you may need to back up additional files. Backing up all of these files on a daily basis will take a significant amount of time. Incremental backups are required, backing up only changed files. To safely manage backup data, you should manage it on an external server. While implementing these steps yourself is possible, utilizing a Git server repository as a storage space for backup data will solve all these issues, making it easier and more secure. You can use GitLab or something similar, but here I'll use GitHub. First, I'll create a repository to store the overall backup tasks and configuration files. I'll also create a repository to manage the deployed web applications. It's best to create a repository for each domain to manage web applications. This allows you to separate domains to different servers or merge them back together depending on traffic, disk space, and other factors. Now, let's actually use Git to handle the backup process. You'll need to install Git. I already have it installed, so I'll skip that step. Websites are typically managed under the www data account, but since I'm working under the root account, I'll temporarily switch to the root account. I'll back up the sites for the gurum.org domain to a Git repository. I'll initialize the gurum.org directory as the Git repository management target. I'll branch to main. I'll connect to the repository I created on the Git server. I'll set the username and email address for each local Git repository path rather than the global one. Ultimately, I'll configure the site's directory to be under the www data account and only allow Git commands to be executed under the www data account. Since storing the Git password could result in unintentional execution of Git commands, I won't configure a credential helper. I'll add all files in the gurum.org directory to Git staged. I'll commit them to back them up to the Git repository. I'll push them to the Git repository. I'll revert the account in the gurum.org directory to the original www data account. I'll clone the Git repository that manages web server settings and database data backups. Since I've only created the Git repository, it's currently empty. I'll set the username and user email to the local Git repository path. Since backup tasks will be run under the root account, I'll set the credential helper to store. The backup tasks directory belongs to the root account. For security reasons, it's a good idea to set permissions so that only the root account can access it. I'll skip that part here. The www data account is the directory that manages sites by domain. I only have one domain here, but if you're serving multiple domains, you may have more directories. I'll manage configuration files and database data backup files in subdirectories within the backup tasks directory. I'll create directories to manage the data targets to be backed up as discussed earlier in the video. I'll write a shell script to back up the configuration files. To serve over HTTPS, you'll need a certificate file. Even though Let's Encrypt can issue certificates directly from the server, you still need to back up the certificate. To issue a certificate with Let's Encrypt, the server's IP address must be registered as a domain in DNS. If the IP address of the domain registered in DNS changes, it may take some time for it to propagate. Therefore, it's best to use the existing certificate in the meantime. Website configuration files are located in the site's available directory, but the configuration files for currently running sites are symbolic links to the site's enabled directory. To back up all site configuration files, back up the files in the site's available directory. To back up only the configuration files for currently running sites, back up the files symbolic links to the site's enabled directory. If you're using Apache Tomcat, you should also back up the server.xml file, which contains host-specific configuration information. I'll grant it execute permissions. I'll manage the shell script file that renews certificates issued by Let's Encrypt in the backup tasks directory. I need to reflect the changed path in the cron job, so I will do that when I register the daily backup. I'll write a shell script to back up sites for the gurum.org domain. I'll be backing up the database data by date, but since this will result in too many files accumulating, I'll delete SQL files dated 1 month prior to the time the shell script is run. Since the directory managing sites by domain is configured not to store passwords for security reasons, I'll need a repository address containing the account name and password. The gurum.org domain uses the gurum database schema, and I'll use the gurum prefix as the backup SQL file name. Therefore, I'll delete any SQL files starting with gurum that are older than 1 month when the shell script is run. I'll append the date of execution to the backup file name of the gurum database schema and dump it. If the database contains a large amount of data, you can compress the dump with gzip to reduce the file size. While extremely unlikely, there may be files that are not associated with the www data account. Therefore, I'll convert all files to the www data account. Since the websites are being used under the www data account, I'll also run git commands under the www data account. Since the Git repository may contain a more recent revision, I'll first run the git pull command under the www data account. I'll add the changed files to Git management. I'll do a local git commit. I'll push to the Git repository. I'll grant execute permissions. Let's write a shell script executable to register as a cron job. Since there may be a more recent revision in the Git repository, I'll start with the git pull command. I'll run a shell script to back up sites by domain. Currently, there's only one domain, but the number of shell scripts to run can be as many as the number of domains. I'll add the modified files to the Git management target. I'll do a local git commit. I'll push to the Git repository. I'll grant execute permission. I'll write an SQL statement to create the schemas that will restore the backed up database data. Currently, there's only one schema, but if there are other schemas in use, you need to create them as well. Backup settings.sh only needs to be run when configuration files are added or changed. Backup runner do.sh can be run whenever a backup is needed, and it will back up to the Git repository. Since the credential helper is set to store, it can be run without entering a password. However, since the password is not yet stored immediately after setting the credential helper to store, you will need to enter it the first time. I will add backup runner do.sh to a cron job to perform daily backups at dawn. The path to the shell script file that renews the certificate issued with Let's Encrypt has changed, so I will correct it. I will run backup runner do sh every day at 2 a.m. If the server's time zone is set to, etc., UTC, but there's a discrepancy between the location of your primary website users and their time zone, you should set it to reflect the time zone offset. Now, incremental backups are automatically run every day at 2 a.m. to the Git repository, allowing you to safely manage your server data. Although not covered here, you can manage your backup files more securely by setting permissions for the backup tasks directory to only allow root access. Next time I'll explain how to set up a new server to serve websites immediately by restoring the backup files. Thank you for watching.